Hello, and welcome back to the Determinants of Health. In our last lecture, we looked at simple measures of low income and poverty, and now, logically, we're going to look at the complicated measurements of low income and poverty. So last time, we talked about the difference between relative and absolute poverty. Remember, relative poverty is relative to a measurement within the population of interest. In other words, if we say that somebody makes more than the average or less than the median or something like that, that's a relative measure. An absolute measure is saying there's a set of external criteria we'll compare you to. For example, if you don't have access to a toilet, if you don't have a roof over your head, if you don't have access to readily available health care, those are indicators of absolute poverty. So keep that straight in your mind, relative versus absolute, because all the measurements are either in one camp or the other, or attempt to combine them. We looked at the global poverty line, which these days is about $2 per day of income. That's an absolute measure because we've decided that $2 should be able to purchase all the necessities of life at the bare minimum. We looked at the low income measure and that should be MBM rather than BMB, the market basket measurement, little arrow there. So the LIM is a relative measure and the MBM is an absolute measure. We looked at the LICO, which is Canada's preferred method, the low income cutoff, and it's kind of a combination of relative and absolute measures. It takes into consideration the size of your family and the size of your community. And it's also based on sample data, hence it's a bit relative. The Americans like the official poverty measurement and the supplementary poverty measurement. Both of them are absolute measurements in the sense that they purport to describe a situation wherein do you have enough resources to acquire the essentials of life. The OPM looks strictly at food, whereas the SPM looks at other measurements of standard of living, including clothes and shelter. So, now that we're talking about more complicated measurements, it's important to remember that this kind of approach is not restricted just to poverty. Lots of organizations seek to find different ways of describing populations for comparison purposes. So a very popular one is called the Human Development Index. The HDI is a score given to a country that ranges from 0 to 1, where 1 is great. It means that you're really well developed, your people have great opportunity, and 0 means life is really hard. It's not necessarily a measurement of poverty, it's a measurement of overall development. The HDI is actually a combination score that looks at life expectancy, educational opportunity and achievement, income. In other words, it's looking to measure the extent to which people living in a country are able to do desirable things. How good is their life? Unsurprisingly, every year that we've been computing this HDI number, the Scandinavian countries tend to rank very highly. So in 2010, Norway scored very high indeed with a score of 0.943, very close to 1. Close on its heels were Australia at 0.929 and the Netherlands. Canada is always up there. We're at least 0.9 or above, so we're doing pretty well. In general, wealthy OECD countries score 0.9 or above, and exceptionally poor countries score much lower. Based upon the experiences using the HDI, which have proven to be quite valuable, the Human Poverty Index was developed. The HPI is very similar to the HDI, but focuses on poverty. Now remember, poverty is not just about income, it's about access to the essentials of life. So in this case, the HPI looks at very similar domains as did the HDI. It looks at health, in this case longevity, it looks at education, in this case literacy, and it looks at some measurement of a standard of living. Sometimes the HPI also includes a measurement of social exclusion. Remember, we had established in an earlier lecture that the extent to which you can engage and collect social capital is often determined by social exclusion. And if you can't participate in your society fully, you are impoverished in an intangible way. So the HPI includes a measurement of social exclusion only for wealthy countries, however. Indeed, the HPI distinguishes between low-income and high-income countries and has a different formula for computing poverty depending upon if your country is rich or not rich. So, here is how it looks for the poor countries, the low-income countries. This is a fancy formula. You can go into detail about the formula if you want, but all I really care about at this stage is that it looks at essentially three things to be measured. It's looking at the probability at birth of not surviving to age 40. That's P1. Okay, so someone had decided that 40 is going to be the magical cutoff for lifespan that we care about. If you make it past 40, you're great. You've beaten most people in your society. It also looks at P2, which is the adult literacy rate. That's going to be a proxy measurement of education. If you can read at a fundamental level, then you are described as being educated. That may not describe your situation. You probably don't consider yourself educated unless you have a high school diploma or a university degree. But in this measurement, it's sufficient to simply know how to read. And lastly, there is a measurement for the average of population with access to improved water source. And that is the proxy measurement for the standard of living. So what they've done here is mathematically combine those three domains, those three descriptions, into something that we can use to compare different countries or communities or areas. For high-income countries, on the other hand, there's a more complicated formula that includes 4 descriptors, not 3. Remember, for low-income countries, we cared about whether or not they live past 40. For high income, we decided that 60 is the goal to reach. We're also looking at literacy again, and we're looking at the population below the income poverty line. This is the low-income measure, a relative measure. We decided that for this measurement, if you make less than 50% of the median, then you're impoverished. And this P4. P4, the rate of long-term unemployment. Why do we care about that? That is our measurement of social exclusion. The assumption there is that if you are unemployed for a long period of time, you're not engaging with your social networks. You're not going to work, you're not making relationships, perhaps you have lowered self-esteem. All these factor into a lesser quality social network. So 2 takeaways from the HPI. The first is that the longevity measurement is different between the high and low income countries. That's quite interesting. And the indicators used for standard of living are different between the high income and low income countries, as well as there not being a social exclusion criterion for low income. This chart summarizes the differences between the measurement for low income versus high income. First, as mentioned, lifespan is defined differently, 40 versus 60. Second, the education or knowledge factor is defined slightly differently, but it's about literacy essentially, so I would argue that's fairly equivalent. The standard of living is interesting. So for high-income countries, we've decided that the poverty line is going to be how we determine whether or not someone is meeting their standard of living. And for low-income countries, it's going to be access to water. And when we say improved water sources, we mean something that's not a river or a stream. We mean something that's pumped, a tap of some kind that's been processed by a municipality, hopefully. And social exclusion. We don't measure social exclusion for the low-income countries, but we've decided that's an important component for the high-income countries. So clearly, the HPI is flawed in many ways, but we relied on it for many years. In 2010, it was decided that something better is required, and so the UN now prefers this new thing called the Multidimensional Poverty Index, the MPI. It's very similar to the HPI, but it has more dimensions associated with it. And the greatest contribution of the MPI is that not only does it look at the percentage or proportion or fraction of people experiencing deprivation, it also looks at how intense that deprivation is. Yeah, so how do we define intensity? Well, let's take a look. The MPI is computed using this very simple looking formula. It's the product of H by A, where H is just the proportion of people who are poor, right? And we're going to define poor a little differently in a second. And A is the intensity of that poverty. So we multiply those two numbers and we get our MPI figure. And that number is going to vary from 0 to 1, where 1, of course, means more deprivation, more suffering, more multidimensional poverty. We want a low number, but we're going to see which countries tend to score highly. Much like the HPI, the MPI relies upon three broad domains of struggle, of deprivation: education, health, and some kind of standard of living. Okay, so how we define health, education, and standard of living is, of course, where there's going to be disagreement. Health, in this case, is going to be defined by indicators describing nutrition and child mortality. The argument here is, for very poor countries and population, health is gated by access to good food. And if you can't keep your children alive, something is tragically wrong. So child mortality becomes one of the most important initial gateways to measuring population health. The educational component is measured by the number of years remaining in school, or spent in school rather. This is a departure from the previous measurement that the HPI had of simply looking at literacy. You can gain literacy fairly quickly, spend a couple of years in school, or learn at home. So the threshold there is quite low. In this case, for the MPI, we're looking at actual number of years spent in school, and so the threshold is a bit higher. For standard of living, they decided that access to some basics like cooking fuel, sanitation, that includes bathrooms, water, in other words, improved water, as mentioned earlier, taps and so forth, electricity, well that's new, a floor. I bet you hadn't thought about that before. Do you have a floor in your house that's not dirt? That's a measurement of a standard of living. And access to a variety of services, including health services and possibly legal services. So this is how it looks. We have our dimensions of deprivation: health, education, and standard of living. We have the various indicators for each of these dimensions, as mentioned earlier, a total of 10 indicators. And this is how they're defined. For example, the years of schooling in row 3. Has anyone in the household not completed 5 years of schooling? So 5 years has now been determined to be the appropriate cutoff for minimum education. Now this last column is the amount of weight that we put on each of these indicators. The first 5 have a 1/6 weight, and the remaining 5 have a 1/18 weight. Interesting. So we decide that each of the last 5 is not worth as much as the top 5. All right, so what do we do with this template, this little matrix? Well, a person is defined as being poor in this way, multidimensionally poor, if that person scores more than a third on the checklist. So after adding up all of the things on that matrix, if they score a total of a third or more, then they are poor. Right? And that's our number H. The intensity, on the other hand, our letter A, is a description of a community. That community, you take the average number of indicators that have more than a third on the checklist, and that becomes a measurement of intensity. Your MPI then is the product of those two numbers. Okay, I know this is not as clear as it should be, so we're going to work through an example. So let's consider a fake country, this country of Dionandia, led by the handsome and intelligent Professor Dionandian. And Dionandia only has 3 residents. They have the quixotic names of Zordon, Quaxlor, and Lucretia. And there's Zordon, Quaxlor, and Lucretia at the bottom there. Intelligent, attractive young citizens of Dionandia. And we're going to collect indicator data on these 3 people, and we're going to attempt to compute the multidimensional poverty index for the nation of Dionandia based on these data. Let's begin, shall we? Okay, so here are the different indicators, the 10 indicators. Here are the total points possible, and which ones Zordon, Quaxlore, and Lucretia checked off. Okay? So in the case of Zordon, somebody in Zordon's house did not get 5 years of schooling. Zordon doesn't have an appropriate floor. Zordon doesn't have good cooking fuel, and he doesn't have access to, by the way, 10 should be access, not assets, access to appropriate services. And the similar distribution for Quaxlore and Lucretia. All right, so we add up all their factors there, and we get Zordon has a total poverty score of 0.33, Quaxlore of 0.5, and Lucretia of 0.28. What do we do with that? Well, we said that if you score a third or more, then you're poor. So Zordon is poor, because 0.33 is a third. Quaxlore is also poor, because 0.5 is over a third. Lucretia is not poor. She made the cutoff, and she's below a third. Great, so 2 out of our 3 residents of Deonandia are multidimensionally poor. 2 out of 3 is 0.67, 67%. Okay, that's our H factor. A is this. So amongst those who are poor, Zordon and Quaxlore, their mean score, if I averaged out 0.33 and 0.5, their mean score is 0.42. That's my intensity measurement, my A. Right? So the MPI of Deonandia is going to be the product of H times A, 0.67 times 0.42, and that gives me 0.28. That is the multidimensional poverty index for the nation of Deonandia, after going through all of the experiences of the individuals here. Obviously, for a given country, we can't go through tens of millions of people and compute their scores. So what is typically done is samples are taken, and this process run through for key individuals, and they are used to generalize to the broader nation. Does it really matter, though? Here's a graph showing the relationship between GNI, which is the x-axis. GNI is gross national income. That's essentially how much money the nation makes. And the y-axis on the left graph is the population living in extreme poverty. So again, this global poverty measurement, this absolute measurement, the 125 a day measurement. Over here, we have the MPI, the multidimensional poverty index, the one that we just computed. But look at the graphs. They're essentially the same. Obviously, they're different, but the same kind of thing is happening here. What this tells us is that there is deep correlation between this new measurement and the old measurement. And this gives us a lot of confidence that we're still measuring more or less the same thing. That deprivation seems to be largely a function of income. So the MPI is only computed for low-income countries, at least so far. In 2016, they had computed measurements for 102 countries, and that accounts for about 75% of the total globe. And we found that about 1.6 billion people are found to be poor based upon this measurement. It's a lot of people, but it's less people than it probably would have been 10, 20, and 30 years ago, because the world is becoming wealthier in many ways. Unsurprisingly, this shows us the distribution of the unlucky 1.6 billion people who are found to be multidimensionally impoverished. The majority are in sub-Saharan Africa, with a fair amount in South Asia as well. So, in summary, we have many different ways of defining and measuring low income and poverty. What we're essentially trying to do here is assign a quantity to a quality or experience. We're trying to say that I am deprived. How do I measure deprivation? Well, the percentage of people who make less than this amount of money. It's not going to be perfect. It's always going to be flawed, because everyone's experience is going to be tainted or accentuated and spiced by their individual circumstances. One size does not fit all. So here's my final thoughts. What does it mean to be poor in a country with a good welfare system? What do I mean by that? Well, a country with no social safety net. If you make X amount of dollars, then you're poor. That's one experience. If you go to another country with a great social safety net, making the same amount of money, you're still poor, but you have more services to rely upon. You have welfare, unemployment benefits. You have socialized medicine and socialized education. You have well taken care of public common grounds, etc. You have food banks and other sources of civic welfare. So maybe it's a little easier to be impoverished in such places than not. I don't know. What do you think? And this last one is quite interesting, especially as we continue to try to develop new ways of measuring poverty and deprivation. Do you think access to electronic information, by which I mean the internet, do you think that's a fundamental necessity and possibly even a right in modern life? Should we include the internet in a modern poverty deprivation checklist? Now, I know you want to say, well, of course not. That's not a right. It's a luxury. But think about it for a second. How do you get a job now without the internet? How do you communicate with employers or with your children or with the world without the internet? How do you get access to information? How do you know anything about the world without the internet? How do you prevent social exclusion without the internet? Is Facebook a human right? I don't know. But it's something for you to think about. Until next time, thank you very much.